Good morning. Thank you so much for coming and joining us on this lovely Tuesday morning. It makes me very excited to see that there's more than the panelists in the room because I wasn't sure how this event was going to turn out. So I'm very happy to see you all here. My name is Dawn Conradi. I am the director of the Child Welfare Education Institute here at Stockton. And I am very proud of the work that our team has done to be able to pull off this event in such a short time because it's very important. And so we're very excited to have you here. A couple quick announcements about the event. We're just going to run straight through. There are no breaks. So if at any point in time you need to get up, there are restrooms right outside the theater, so you can quickly go and then return. But otherwise, we're going to keep on rolling the entire time through. In your folders, you will also see that there is an evaluation. If you would please make sure to complete that and drop that at the table on your way out at the end of the day, that's great. For those of you who are looking to get CEs, we do need you to sign out next to your name as well, so please make sure you stop at the table to do that too. Additionally, we will be following up via email with an electronic copy of all of the resources as well as the CEU certificate for those of you who need it. And so you can be on the lookout for that in the next couple days. And additionally, we are actually recording today's event because we feel that it's so important. And so when that is available, we'll share that with you so then you can distribute it to those who weren't able to attend. And the final thing that I want to mention about the folders is that you'll notice that you have a note card in it. And what we would like you to do is throughout the duration of the panelist presentations, if you have any questions, to write your question on those note cards. And then what will happen is at the conclusion of Michelle's presentation, we'll ask you to send your note cards to the end of your rows. And Dan or Elena will come by to collect your questions, and then we're going to feed off from either side, having them ask the questions. So that way we can try and get as many questions in as possible rather than trying to run the mics around all over the place. So keep that in mind and write your questions down. And then whatever questions we aren't able to get through, I will share them with the panelists and ask them to respond, and we'll include that in our resources that we're sending out as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs, Michelle McDonald, to say a few words on behalf of our leadership. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, you're away. First, on behalf of our President, Harvey Kesselman, and our Provost, Lori Vermeulen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Stockton University this morning. The topic that you're exploring could not be more timely. Much of the country is justifiably outraged by the current presidential administration's decision to separate undocumented children from their families, and although that order has since been ameliorated, according to Homeland Security figures, as I'm sure you know, more than 2,000 children were separated from their parents within a matter of weeks, and many have yet to be reunited. Sadder still is that what is being done at the border is no different than what the government has done to families for centuries. The sad fact is that state-sanctioned family separation has a very long history in our country, and those of you among our faculty here on campus who know me as a historian of North American history will not be surprised by what I'm about to say. It began during slavery with the brutal daily and fully legal practice of buying and selling children from their parents. And about the same time that the slave trade was abolished, the government began the practice of forcibly removing Native American children as young as 5 from their families in order to civilize them in white boarding schools, a practice that lasted for more than 100 years and formally ended only in 1978 with the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it's been just 3 decades since President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Union Act of 1988, our federal government's apology for what former First Lady Barbara Bush has called one of the most shameful episodes of U.S. history, Japanese-American internment of families and children during World War II. In other words, difficult as it is to say, we should be saddened and appalled and angered by what is happening, but we should not be surprised. Stockton is proud of the work of its Child Welfare Education Institute, and particularly of the work of Diane Falk and Don Conradi here today. Its mission is to support the ongoing transformation of the public child welfare system through social work education and professional training. To provide, in other words, for the safety and well-being of children and families in New Jersey, among whom are our most challenged and most vulnerable. It is appropriate, therefore, that they are hosting today's event, and I am pleased that so many of you chose to answer their invitation. I wish you all the best in what will be a challenging day. And again, I welcome you to Stockton University. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Next, I would like to introduce our co-principal investigator, Dr. Diane Falk. If it were not for her, I would not be standing here because she had the vision 14, 15 years ago with our first program, the Baccalaureate Child Welfare Education program. And from there, we went on to our second program and beyond. So she clearly is a visionary, and so it is no surprise that we were able to have such a beautiful statement crafted that she'll share with you. And you can see where the inspiration for this event comes from. So without further ado, Diane, I'd like to welcome you to the stage.
Good morning. Again, welcome to Stockton. That's your third welcome this morning. You'll probably get more. It's great to see so many of you come out for this very important discussion. Today's event is being sponsored by Stockton University's Child Welfare Education Institute. So I'll give you a little of the background of that institute. 15 years ago, the state of New Jersey was in the midst of a crisis in public child welfare. Stories depicting details of severe child abuse and neglect, even child deaths, filled the front pages of major newspapers, not only in New Jersey, but throughout the country. Moved to offer our assistance to the state's public child welfare agency, a small group of social work faculty began to lay the groundwork for what has now become the Child Welfare Education Institute. The Institute now manages 3 programs: the Baccalaureate Child Welfare Education Program, the Master's Child Welfare Education Program, and the New Jersey Child Welfare Training Partnership Southern Region. The first 2 programs are statewide, and the third serves 13 counties in the southern part of the state. For the past 14 years, Stockton's Child Welfare Education Institute, which we refer to as CWEI, programs have been working in partnership with the New Jersey Department of Children and Families, the New Jersey chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, and the social work programs, all of the social work programs in the state of New Jersey's colleges and universities, to assure that our state's vulnerable children are protected from neglect and abuse through educating prospective and currently employed child welfare workers in the most up-to-date evidence-based child welfare practices. Altogether, since 2005, 551 graduates of its programs have moved into caseworker, supervisory, and administrative positions throughout New Jersey's public child welfare systems. In addition, hundreds of child welfare professionals have attended trainings to continue honing their skills. Originally, CWEI programs aimed at addressing a crisis in New Jersey's public child welfare system, and its work has helped our state to emerge as having a public child welfare system that is now serving as a model for our country. I would like to point out that the members of the Child Welfare Education Institute include Dawn Conradi, myself, Joseph Everett, who you'll meet shortly, John Seawright, who's sitting over there, who helped in the original idea of this program, Maya Lewis, I'm not sure if she's here today, Robin Hernandez McConan, Narina Parrish, Dan Ackerman, who is here somewhere, and Allison Monroe. So you can read about them on the statement that's included in your pamphlet. Now we are witnessing a major crisis in child welfare in our nation. Public child welfare agencies are established by governmental bodies to protect children from neglect and abuse, usually by their parents or caretakers. Yet what we are seeing now is our federal government engaging in activities that are abusive to children and destructive of families. And I'll quote from the statement that's included in your folder. We contemplate with disbelief and horror our country's current action against families and children at our nation's southern border. In the past few weeks, we have witnessed forcible separation of children from parents, haphazard transporting of children to placements that may be thousands of miles from their parents, holding children in cages, warning caretakers not to touch distressed children, placing children in the custody of those who do not speak the child's language, and parents being unable to communicate with or locate their children, and many other things. Members of Congress and mayors have been denied access to facilities where children are held, raising further questions about the conditions within. All of this has subjected thousands of children to trauma, which is demonstrated negatively to affect their current well-being and future development. The faculty and staff of the Child Welfare Education Institute felt a need to educate ourselves and our community about what is happening at our nation's southern border, and to speak out against policies and practices that traumatize children. That is why we created the statement that you can read in the folder, which I've just read from, and that is why we are presenting this panel today. And I want to frame this discussion in the framework of human rights, which I think Michael Rodriguez will further discuss. But the right to seek asylum is established in Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. This is one of the most important obligations in international law. Most of the families now coming across our southern border are fleeing persecution and violence in their own countries, mainly Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Asylum may be granted to people who are already in the United States and are unwilling or unable to return to their home country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. People who have reached the United States, whether legally or illegally, have the right to request asylum under international law and U.S. law, and have the right to an asylum hearing. It is important to keep this in mind as we examine some of the issues relating to the children and families we are discussing today. Our panelists, in order of their presentation, include Dr. Michael Rodriguez, on the right, Associate Professor of Political Science, Dr. Robin Hernandez McConan, Assistant Professor who's about to become Associate Professor of Social Work, Dr. Preeti Haria, Associate Professor of Education and Special Education, and Michelle Douglas, Lead Attorney and owner of My Rights Lawyers in Summers Point. COA staff member Joe Everett will give a more detailed introduction to each presenter just before their presentation. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist for this morning to talk about some of the context and history of this issue, to put it in perspective for us. Our first panelist is Michael Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is an associate professor of political science here at Stockton University and the coordinator of our university's Washington Internship Program. He holds degrees in political science from Princeton University, the University of Texas at Austin, and Temple University. His research interests include race and identity, immigration, the pedagogy of critical thinking, and religion and politics. Professor Rodriguez is currently co-authoring a book on race and identity among Latinos in the United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rodriguez to the podium.
I think I'm not seeing the text. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, good morning again. Not bad. One more time. Good morning. Very good. I'm very grateful to you for coming. Grateful to the Institute for the invitation to speak with you for a few minutes, and it will be not very many minutes. So every time I say that to my students, it always turns out to be many more minutes. So bear with me on that. I do not have a personal immigrant story other than to say that I am a presumed immigrant. I can't tell you how many times in sort of casual conversation, people that I meet for the first time will ask, so where are you from? I say, Texas. And then they ask, no, where are you really from? I say, well, San Antonio. Indeed, I was born and raised in San Antonio. My parents are from San Antonio, my grandparents, great-grandparents. We go back many, many generations in Texas to the time when Texas was part of Mexico. And it was also an independent country for a while. You might know that we were incorporated into the U.S., so I refer to myself as an incorporated person at times. And I tell my students that my family did not come to the U.S., rather the U.S. came to us. And there are millions of us in the U.S. with that sort of pedigree. And when I say that to students, they're surprised. Often they think that Latinos are recent immigrants, either first-generation immigrants or certainly the parents came from another country. So that's interesting because it touches upon something that I want to discuss today, and that is how we frame our discussions and our deliberations on immigration. The title that I had was to talk about the history and the push-pull factors. Typically, scholars identify, factors in the, sort of sending countries that push immigrants out, and then factors in the receiving countries that sort of pull or entice migrants to come in. I'm not going to talk about that so much because as I was preparing for this, it occurred to me there is another sort of back and forth push-pull dynamic, and that, sort of metaphorically, and that is how we debate and deliberate immigration and what's happening right now at the border. So I'm going to spend my presentation really talking about some of the features of how we rhetorically frame our deliberation and public discourse on immigration. That's what I want to do today. Let me go back. I think this is not where I want it to be. Yeah. I do have an academic interest in migration. I'm a part of a steering committee that formed a migration studies minor that just recently was approved by the faculty senate, and I think last week the board of trustees was to consider the final approval. I don't know whether anyone knows whether that was a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I hope it was a thumbs up. So that'll be offered in the fall for the first time to our students, and if we have any Stockton students here, I strongly encourage you to think about doing a minor in migration studies. I also teach a course in politics of immigration. This past spring was the first time that I taught that course. So I think I've thought a lot about the pedagogy of teaching, the pedagogy of teaching about issues that are very controversial. I'm very much concerned when I enter a classroom and I stand before students that when they look at me, they don't presume that I am of a certain position just because of the way I look, or because of my name, or because of my sort of party affiliation, if they think they know what that is, and oftentimes they don't. What I try to do is to talk about how we analytically frame our understanding, how we think about issues. They're very important. Just to give you a quick example. What is the difference between an estate tax and a death tax? You might know that there is no difference. But we've had a long-standing history in this country of taxing the assets of property, the stocks and whatever that people pass on to their children, and then beyond a certain threshold of value, and that's always been pretty high. This has been a tax on the estates of the rich. And it's interesting because whenever we use a term, it denotes something, what it means, but then it also connotes something. The estate tax connotes, mansions, the rich, the affluent, things that most of us are not. So when we think about the estate tax, it doesn't pertain to us necessarily. But a death tax, we all die. And it seems like this, the denotation is that we're being taxed upon our death. Well, there was an effort, by mobilized interest through focus groups and whatnot, to sit people down and ask them, what comes to mind when you think about the estate tax? What comes to mind when you think about the death tax? And all these memos went out to party operatives, do not say estate tax, say death tax. And that's one of the ways in which mobilized interests were able to get rid of it because of the way it was framed. It's very political how we frame things. It's a lot of power. Whoever defines the terms of debate and discourse wins half the battle. Does that relate to immigration? Certainly. Are we talking about criminals? Are we talking about humans? Are we talking about families? Are we talking about children? Are we talking about the rule of law? Whatever starting point we have, oftentimes frame the sort of structure of deliberation, the structure of discourse, and oftentimes there are certain implications that follow from your starting point. So I think it's very important to step back and analyze and evaluate, even interrogate our frameworks for analysis and how we approach these sorts of things. About 2 years ago, I wrote a chapter for a book on race in America on birthright citizenship. How many of you, raise your hand if you would know what that is? Okay, a lot of folks don't realize. The United States is rather unique among many countries in the world. If you are born in this country, you are a citizen of this country, irregardless of the immigration status of your parents. This is a result of the 14th Amendment, and which undid all the efforts in the South, especially to render African Americans non-citizens, indeed non-persons, for the sake of constitutional protections. And the 14th Amendment says that if you're born here, again, you are a citizen. Period. It's pretty clear. In 1898, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of a Chinese American who was born here and went to China and lived there for some time, then came back to the U.S., and he was stopped at a port in I think, San Francisco. And he was denied entry into the country on the presumption that because he lived in China for a few months, that his loyalty was elsewhere, and that he was presumptively not an American. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was very clear. If you are born here, even if your parents are not citizens, and indeed, like his parents, were not even eligible to become naturalized under the Chinese Exclusion Act. This case was in 1898. And more recently, in April 2015, Congress held hearings, very serious hearings. There was an effort to revisit this basic constitutional guarantee and make it, quite possibly, so that if you are born here but your parents are not, or at least one of your parents is not a citizen, that you are not presumptively a citizen anymore, to strip you of birthright citizenship. If you were to have gone to the website of Donald Trump when he was candidate, that was indeed one of his positions. Thankfully, he didn't pursue it beyond the campaign, but this was a very serious effort. Now, that also relates to what we're talking about today, because one of the justifications for stripping children born here of citizenship was to punish and to deter others from coming to the U.S. and having children here, the sort of infamous anchor baby myth, right? And that goes counter to a very basic constitutional norm that you don't punish children for the sins of the parents. And you don't punish people for the sake of deterrence. This also relates to what we're talking about today, because under the kind of separation and detention that we've been experiencing, one can certainly characterize it not only as a form of punishment, but as a form of, and I'll coin this phrase, deterrent detention, which is new and very troubling and very problematic. So this is not something that's new. These efforts to, again, punish, to deter, and one can raise a very interesting question as to whether or not this is also collective punishment, which according to international law is not justified, but again, that doesn't prevent countries from doing that, even democratic ones. So for today, I have 4 basic questions I want to have us think about. The first one is family separation a unique historical moment? Michelle McDonald already gave us a history on that, and I won't say much more than, I want to point you to a couple of exhibitions that I think would be of interest to you to learn more about this. The second question is, do migrants have rights under the U.S. Constitution? Are they persons for purposes of constitutional protection? There's this thing that, again, I will coin here, is constitutional personhood. Does the Constitution recognize you as a person and then attach all the guarantees and protections that everyone else has under the Constitution to you? That's actually a very important question in this debate. Is family separation a violation of human rights? And we'll go over some of the conventions that have already been mentioned, but others as well. And then, how do we think of migrants? What is the starting point? Are they individuals? Or are they individuals who are part of a group with a collective consciousness, if you will, a collective sort of conspiratorial strategy to come into the country, to invade it, or to use a term that's been out there recently, to infest the country, to undo and remake its culture, to undermine its economy. That idea, that this mythology, that groups have this intrinsic essence, this groupness about them, is also part of how we frame this discussion and debate on immigration generally, and then more specifically, family separation and detention. So in terms of family separation, is it a unique historical moment? The Associate Provost already sort of reviewed some of that history that's very troubling, and is indeed a big part of the trajectory of American history. You know, part of the moral outrage against what's been going on at the border is that it is not who we are, but that sort of begs the question, who are we? If part of our history has been indeed to separate children from their parents in slavery, and also for decades with Native Americans, and this has been codified into law and informally supported by churches, is not that also part of who we are and part of who we have been as a nation? And I would recommend that you go, if you've had the opportunity. I have not myself gone to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but there's a Weeping Tears exhibition. Again, chronicles, slavery, of course, was absolutely horrendous, but to compound that with ripping children from their parents, from their mothers and fathers, and to sell them as property is just a whole nother level of horror and state-sponsored abuse and terror that was very commonplace. So I would recommend that exhibition to you. Or go to the website for the National Museum of the American Indian, and they have material on the boarding school phenomenon that was also referenced by Michelle McDonald. Long history of separating, not by voluntary actions or choice, but forcibly removing children from their parents, de-Indianizing them, because the presumption was otherwise that, and this relates again to our topic, that Indians could not be assimilated as Indians. So they had to be undone as Indians and remade as Americans. There was also some reference to a comment made recently by former First Lady Laura Bush, comparing the separation of families at the border with the family internment of Japanese Americans. She said that it was cruel and immoral, and also said that it was eerily reminiscent of what we did during the Second World War. And that was followed up by George Takei from Star Trek fame, who himself was in an internment camp at the age of 5. And he said that in some ways this is worse because at least during internment the families were kept intact. So there is this similarity in how we frame public deliberation, not just in terms of how we understand what happened historically with the Japanese Americans. And by the way, there was a lot of support for the internment of Japanese during the Second World War. I read recently that when the Executive Order 9066 came down from FDR, that there was a collective sigh of relief among Americans. And it was very notable to me that the article presumed that when the term Americans was used, that it was referring to white Americans, not Japanese Americans. But what made it sort of resonate with Americans was this idea that there was this collective threat back then from Japanese Americans. Rumors by the War Department, and I call them rumors because there was really no evidence for them, rumors that Japanese Americans were signaling Japanese warships off the coast of California, fed into the hysteria, the anti-Japanese hysteria, and justified in the minds of many the internment of Japanese. A former professor of mine, in fact, at Rutgers University when I was in graduate school, Peter Irons, was instrumental in the reparations movement for Japanese Americans. And through Freedom of Information Act petitions, he secured materials from the War Department, the Defense Department, the War Department back then, and found that there was no evidence. In fact, they knew that what they were saying publicly about this collective threat from Japanese Americans was false. Even J. Edgar Hoover did not find any evidence that there was subversion and collaboration by Japanese Americans during that time. But again, that's how rhetorically the discourse, the deliberation on what to do with Japanese Americans was framed, and that resonated deeply with many, many Americans. So do migrants have rights under the U.S. Constitution? I often ask my students, does the Constitution protect citizens or persons? And many of them were actually surprised to learn that the Constitution protects, especially the 14th Amendment, persons. Persons that are within the boundaries of the U.S. Whether or not you're a citizen, whether or not your parents are a citizen, you don't have all the protections of a citizen, but you are not without protections from the Constitution, including due process and equal protection. So if you are a non-citizen, an adult or a child, what due process rights or guarantees are required in detention? Well, due process, by the way, is procedural. There are certain requirements that the procedures the government follows must be fair, they must be reasonable, they must be the least restrictive means of securing the administration of justice. They cannot be arbitrary or capricious, and they cannot be punitive in nature or for the purpose of punishment. So what's the difference between punishment and punitive? Well, punishment, if the purpose is to punish explicitly, that's a violation of due process. Now, it may well be that government does not intend to punish, but the way in which it detains one is punitive. We don't punish people when we detain them unless we imprison them after they've been sentenced by the criminal justice system. So, of course, one of the questions that is raised by what's going on at the border is, whether this deterrent detention is itself a form of imprisonment, a form of punishment. And if it's collective, all the more so is it problematic from a constitutional perspective. So I mentioned this notion of deterrent detention. We have pretrial detention, preventive detention, mandatory detention, and that's typically justified when somebody is at risk of flight, when they are a danger to the community, or perhaps a national security threat. But to detain people, children, adults, for the sake of deterring others is actually rather new. And there might be others who might want to challenge that, but as far as I know, that is not a conventional understanding of purposes behind and justifications behind detention. There's a very interesting case that I ran across as I was preparing for this called Yadvidas v. United States back in 2001. The attorneys among us might be familiar with that case. Without getting into the details of that case, the question before the court was whether or not it was constitutional to hold somebody, a criminal alien, an alien is their term, not mine. The question was whether it is constitutional or is it consistent with due process to hold a criminal alien in indefinite detention if all good faith efforts by the government to find another country that would accept this person have failed. And in the majority opinion by Justice Breyer, he acknowledged a longstanding distinction that matters to us here today, but a bit esoteric, and that is, it matters a lot from the standpoint of due process in the Constitution whether you are a person present and living within the U.S. or whether you are a person at the threshold of entry to the U.S. So if you are within the U.S., if you are present and living, even if you are here illegally, you have what I would term again constitutional personhood. The Constitution recognizes you as a person, and then all the, again, guarantees and protections attached to you as well. This also actually relates to the abortion debate. At what point does personhood begin? Right? So this is not just a theoretical point. It's actually an important point. So Justice Breyer said, well, there is this distinction that's important. You know, people at the border do not have the same constitutional rights, especially in terms of due process, as people that live within the boundaries of the U.S. And there were two dissenting opinions that were very interesting in this case, one by Justice Kennedy, who recently announced, oh my God, really? What I told you. There was some debate among the dissents, and they did not accept the notion that if you are in the country, if you are present and living in the country, but you are illegal, that you have essentially extinguished, forfeited your rights to due process. That underlies how we are treating the children and the parents at the border. Just this morning I was at the grocery store and I was telling this woman that I was the clerk that was coming here, and she was asking me about this topic, and I said, well, you know, her response was, well, they shouldn't be here. So that justifies whatever punishment they receive. So I sort of went into this whole other thing about the Constitution, and then I thought, wait a minute, this is getting me nowhere, so I left. But these are actually important aspects of how we deliberate the question before us. Is family separation a violation of human rights? I won't go into all these conventions, but the underlying notion is that the family unit is sacred, that everybody has a liberty interest in protecting the parent-child relationship, and the government cannot violate that bond unless it has a very compelling interest, and that interest must be the best interest of the child. Not politics, not deterrence, not achieving some broader public policy objective. It's the child's best interest. So I would recommend that you go to these conventions, Articles 7 and 9, Articles 17, 23, and 24. And again, it just is a very powerful underscoring that the family unit is the fundamental unit of society. It is a sacred bond, one that cannot be violated by arbitrary and capricious means by any government. So how do we think about migrants? I would argue, I would submit to you, that in the discourse, the deliberation, we place refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, legal migrants, MS-13 on the continuum, on the same continuum. And then we rhetorically blur the distinctions between these categories. And these are the distinctions that are very important, so that then we take the most dangerous element in that continuum, MS-13, and then we generalize to the entire population. So that if certain immigrants, illegal immigrants, are not actively, members of MS-13, they could be. They are potentially, because they're all part of this group. And they all share this sort of group, characteristic that I mentioned, this groupness about them. So that's a threat from that entire group, and we must act accordingly. There are academics that push this line as well. Samuel Huntington, a very important, celebrated political scientist of the 20th century in the Hispanic challenge, characterized people like me as having a sort of broad conspiracy to come to the country and retake the Southwest, to make this country bilingual, to redo and remake the culture of this country, and that we share that agenda. And this is from one of the most important political scientists in this country. So I leave you with this question. How do you frame, how do you accept, what is your starting point for discussing, for deliberating, for engaging in public discourse on immigration? Is it, again, the child, the family, the status, the legal status of people that try to enter the country? All these things are very important because the framework that we operate within oftentimes determines the outcomes that we embrace. And if the premise, if the starting point is problematic, the conclusions and the implications can also be very harmful and very troubling, and at times we may accept them without thinking them through. The woman this morning at the store, after we talked for a few minutes, said, I hadn't thought about that, and why is it more people aren't telling us? Well, that's one of the reasons why we gather, and we talk, and we deliberate, and we do it respectfully. Thank you very much. I think I did it?
Thank you very much, Dr. Rodriguez, for providing that theoretical framework for us to think about this question. Our next panelist will drill down a little bit and look at the effects, the trauma of child separation, how it plays out on a more individual level. Dr. Robin Hernandez-McConen is an associate professor of social work and one of our faculty members in the Child Welfare Education Institute here at Stockton. Dr. Hernandez-McConen has 20 years of child welfare experience and has been engaged in research and policy work for the past decade. Her areas of interest are child welfare system reform, Title IV-E, and workforce development, adverse childhood experiences, and the intersection of child welfare and immigration, as well as Mexican diaspora and mixed method research and policy. With an emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration, Dr. Hernandez-McConen has worked on a number of influential projects and reform efforts on behalf of children and families in the Delaware Valley and nationally. Currently, Dr. Hernandez-McConen's work is focusing on the New Jersey child welfare system reform and migration. Her primary teaching includes social welfare policy, research methods, trauma-informed child welfare practice, and child migration and immigration, an international course involving study tour in Guatemala. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hernandez-McConen to the podium.
Thank you. Welcome again. All right. So, just to kind of provide a transition from Michael's framework, regardless of how you think about migrants or the experience of this group as they enter the United States or come to the borders of the United States, the experience they have are as individuals. And so my presentation will talk a little bit about, or a lot about, the trauma of the experience of those who are approaching our borders or entering our country or currently within our country. So just to contextualize, and I think everyone's kind of talked about this, Michelle McDonald and Diane and Michael have all helped us think about how we think about migrants to our country or immigrants. And it's not always the pilgrims who were seeking religious freedom in a way where they come in nice, colorful clothes, carrying their children who are all healthy and approaching our shores with the dreams of religious freedom. But we have a lot of other sordid history in this country of how immigrants or migrants have entered our borders, our land ports, and our seaports as well. And so I just wanted to remind us of things that have caused people to migrate to this country, to contextualize some of the push-pull factors that we see. And so some of the people who have come to this country have not come willingly. Some people have come willingly to escape things like famine and poverty. And some people have come as a result of the Holocaust and persecution in their own country. Many of those people were denied entry to our country at some point. There are refugees all over the world, and the United States is the least accepting country in the world for refugees. We accept the least of any country in the world. And then, of course, we have our borders and people migrating from land masses that are connected to our country. But just a reminder that we do have the Statue of Liberty that has a little bit of a slogan for us about sending us tired, poor, huddled masses who are yearning to breathe free. Just a little bit of context in terms of New Jersey to make this real for you. Why it matters for us. In New Jersey, we are the 5th most receiving state of immigrants in the country. These numbers are a few years old. Forgive me because some of them are not more recently published in the same way. But we can see from 2011 to 2015, we actually went down 1% of the people who are immigrating to the state of New Jersey. And the percentage of children in the state who are actually foreign-born is very small. It's about 5%. But we have children who are in about 37% in 2015 are children who are living in immigrant families or families who have one parent who is not a U.S. citizen or who has immigrated and been naturalized. And so there are 89% of the children who are living in these families are actually citizens. That means they've received their birthright citizenship or in some way have been naturalized, which is less common. And then a very small percent of the people in New Jersey have families where the parent has only been here for 5 years or less. In terms of the places of origin that we see immigrants in New Jersey, of course the #1 region is Latin America. And that's about 50% of, that's only half of the immigrants that we have in New Jersey in terms of points of origin. The next biggest group is from Asia, and then Europe, and then finally Africa, continent-wise. So who are the children in terms of what we're seeing and what we're experiencing in this country in terms of the migration of youth and children and families? The big surge that most of us kind of recall or think about or identify with was the surge in 2014. And this was the first time probably in the US history where the majority of children coming to the borders were unaccompanied, were youth coming from Central American countries that were less Mexico than any other country. More of them were coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and only 1/3 of them had actually had family members already here to kind of call, in some way push them to come or pull them to come. So that means 2/3 of the youth who came unaccompanied from the Triangle countries or Central American countries came on their own, independently seeking a different situation for themselves. And the current crisis that we're experiencing now in this current past several months, perhaps 6 months, is the result of a zero-tolerance policy, which is a new initiative by this current government that has not been completely undone, despite the highlights in the media, and that is being enforced despite people's claims of asylum when they approach the borders or ports of entry, and then results in forced separation of children and families. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about trauma and what is happening and how it happens to the kids and the families that are arriving. So trauma is this emotional response, right? So according to the American Psychological Association, it is a clinical state, a clinical response to a certain series of events, specific event, or combination of events. And it results in physiological responses to those events and the trauma or the experience of those events and the impact of those events on the individual who's experienced them. So what I would like to characterize the current migration movement as complex trauma. And this complex trauma, when we talk about it in child maltreatment, and I do work in child maltreatment and child welfare a lot, is really that this is the trauma that's associated with injury or maltreatment or neglect that's inflicted by a caregiver. But when we talk about caregivers, we also talk about those who are responsible for a child's well-being. And in this particular situation, as children and families approach our borders or are in a situation where they're exposed to other people being entrusted with their well-being and care, I argue that this is an exposure that those children experience as a result of those being entrusted with their care and that are failing to properly or adequately care for them, or in fact inflicting more harm or damage on those children as they experience our systems. So children have more complex problems, and these things are impacted and grow exponentially from young ages through early adolescence, later adolescence, and eventually adulthood, which is why this is really important for us. We have an entirely new generation of children that are in our country that will likely stay in our country for years to come, and we will be dealing with the ramifications, the repercussions of the way that we've treated them and their families as they've approached us for safety and refuge. So the literature, and everyone knows the literature, of course, who's taken my class, or who will take my class, who's currently taking my class, that there are 4 distinct stages of migration trauma. And we talk about these being the experience before migrating, what has happened to push or pull families away from where they've been, from their home. The second part is the in-transit trauma, and I argue that there's now a 2.5, which is the forced separation during that in-transit trauma, or the in-transit phase. Then there is the trauma of being resettled as they arrive, what happens, where they go, what they do. And then, of course, the trauma of post-migration living, and that's the experience that we see children experiencing in schools. And Preeti will talk a little bit more about that, children and families who are experiencing, in some ways, what some of us consider psychological torture of the current administration's policies of enforcement and kind of harassment and xenophobic atmosphere or climate that we've created in many situations in the U.S. So just to think about the baseline trauma, and Michael touched a little bit about how some people have come or arrived here, but to talk about why people would leave their home, and in any refugee case, and any person seeking safety, you must know that the place they are leaving has to be much worse than the place they are going for them to leave, and that the risk of death or all of the other horrible things that can happen in transit has got to be less than the risk of death and horrible things if they stay. Does that make sense? I just want to emphasize that. You don't get on a boat that is highly likely to sink or some people die unless not getting on the boat is less safe. And that's important for us to think about. So in these countries, in the triangle countries, the pushing countries, there's a great amount of drug trade that's happening and narcotraficantes. And so we see lots of corridors of drug trafficking and kind of gang activity related to those drug trafficking corridors and pathways. Neither are the people in these countries producers or consumers of those drugs. The consumers are us. We are the best consumers of narcotics in the world. We create a very significant demand for narcotics that requires a lot of push from Central American countries to traffic them here. There are also a lot of natural disasters and disintegrating infrastructures we see in our own country, in Puerto Rico, that we have not done a good job handling those natural disasters. And if you can imagine countries that don't have a setup kind of like FEMA or adequate resources to address natural disasters, Not that they're not willing to do it, but that they just simply don't have that structure, that an earthquake or a flood simply demolishes a community and there is no fixing it or replacing it. People are displaced. Crops are lost, livestock are lost, land, homes, everything can be lost as a result of those disasters. Of course, there's murder, rape, and violence as a result of the drug trafficking. And there are the occasional, like a third of our people in New Jersey have some pulling factors with regard to family reunification. Someone from their family has already arrived, is established some roots here, and the person is coming to reunify with them. And of course, work. So poverty is a big push factor from countries of origin when there simply is no work and your family is on the brink of starvation and you feel compelled to leave so that you can find a way to help your family survive. We know that 11% of the Latino immigrants have reported previous exposure to political violence, which is grounds for political asylum in this country. So in transit, many of you have seen the images of the train and the ways people arrive from countries that are relatively far away. Many things are at risk during this transit phase. There's sexual assault, rape, violence, trafficking. There is trading sex for passage. There's, of course, the results of those transactional sex instances. There's, of course, hunger, dehydration, injury, exhaustion. I can tell you stories about children who've passed with their parents who've gone traipsing through the desert, through the night for weeks, sometimes months on end, waiting for a passage, who've walked over dead bodies, who've had to take shoes off of dead bodies because their feet are raw and bleeding, people who've had to leave elderly people in their party behind because they can no longer make the journey with them. Even though that person's still alive and seems to be cognizant, they have to leave them in the desert so that the group can continue to move. There's evidence of border patrol destroying stashes of water and food that people have left for others. And then there's also, of course, the idea of being arrested. And that's not a pleasant experience for anyone who's been arrested. So there's this idea that once you get here, you can proclaim you would like to have asylum or that you're seeking safety. And the zero tolerance policy has made that deliberately made that a deterrent for people wanting to come to this country to seek asylum due to the circumstances in their own countries. We have decided that we would make an example, as Michael had talked about, of families coming here by creating a situation that is worse for them to experience. So the trauma that families experience when they're separated includes this idea that children feel that their caregivers are unable to care for them and that the people around them are not protecting them. Of course, you hear the stories in the media of children being separated because the mother is told they're taking the child to give a shot or to the restroom or for some kind of form paperwork, and the child never comes back. Children are being told stories in detention facilities, according to the media and the senators who have visited, that their parents have abandoned them, that their parents have left them, they went somewhere else, and they just left their children in the care of the facility. So there's a lot of mistrust, there's a lot of dishonesty, and I would argue psychological abuse taking places in the facilities as well, in addition to physical abuse. There are several ramifications of this kind of trauma with children over long periods of time, and we see these separations happening for months on end at this point, only because we have court orders really demanding that the children be reunified, which is failing, I would say, miserably. That's my anecdotal take on it. But we see these ramifications of this trauma impacting children's attachment, their ability to attach with their caregiver or anyone else for that matter. These things extend long into adolescence and adult life and their relationships. Their biology, the trauma is read into our physiology and how we experience other parts of our life. Mood regulation, how do these children respond and react in school or in other environments that may be considered dangerous or threatful for them or triggering their responses. They experience dissociation. They have difficulty controlling behaviors. They seem erratic at times. Cognition, we know that there's actually there's an impact on children's IQ scores and their ability to process information as trauma impacts them in a profound way. Their self-concept, of course, who they are, their value, their worth, their self-efficacy. All right, so what happens then once you have a traumatic stress is that in many cases, in fact about 15%, depending on the data or the research study, can manifest into PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a diagnosable condition from the DSM-5 that creates a situation where you are now in a clinical state requiring some sort of intervention, whether it's pharmacological or whether it's an intervention, a therapeutic intervention. But we know that the numbers of who experiences traumatic stress versus who then manifests into PTSD range anywhere. But we look at the last figure, and I would just point out that 5 to 95% of those who survive disasters can experience PTSD, and that number is all over the place in terms of the different research studies and the different populations that we've looked at. So I would say there's a good chance that many of the children who are experiencing separation from their families will at some point have those traumatic symptoms manifest into post-traumatic stress disorder if they aren't already. So how is this working then in terms of the brain, and why do all these things happen? So just a little bit of brain science. I know that's kind of early in the morning for brain science, but some of you will be super excited and charged about brain science. Yeah. There is a cortex, which is a part of your brain that is responsible for memory, attention, perception, and all of the fun things we do, like thinking, laughing, and just being conscientious and conscious. And the trauma that we experience in our brain damages the connection or the crosstalk between these hemispheres of our brain that govern our emotion. And there's a picture covering the last part of the word. So these changes can affect, like I said, the IQ, ability to regulate emotions, and lead to fearfulness, a sense of insecurity, need for protection. In school-age children, which Preeti is going to talk a little bit more about how we come together as a community to handle these situations, we see that this trauma manifests. We know kids, if they don't go anywhere else, they're going to go to school. And they often show up in schools, and they often show up there just to show up. And what we do once they show up has got to be something special. Because at this point, children who are school-aged, they have problems sustaining attention, as you can imagine with any maltreated child. What's happening at home? Are my siblings safe? Is everybody okay? Managing their fears or anxiety and controlling impulses is a big problem that teachers struggle with when they're trying to maintain classroom decorum in an elementary school or school-age environment. And so children also have all these other kind of things like difficulties learning and difficulty controlling startle reaction if there's a loud noise in the classroom. And this can be fearfulness or aggressiveness, depending on the child how it manifests. In adolescence, which is a big group of children that continue to come unaccompanied, and this interferes with their prefrontal cortex. So this is a thing where they consider and make decisions about behaviors. They appraise whether something's danger or safe. I would argue that many teenagers already have clouded ideas of risk-taking and decision-making as a mother of an adolescent. But imagine that worse. I mean, working with a teenager who's not just a regular teenager, but someone who is exponentially worse in terms of those decision-making and understanding of risk and safety. And then that creates the idea of that there's lots of risk-taking behavior, and we see other kind of dangerous activities, potentially dangerous activity or delinquent-type activity happening, along with mental health concerns. So what happens as the children come to our border with their families and are separated, we argue that there's a small body of, and the number is almost always underreported in child welfare systems. It's probably we call it institutional abuse in child welfare. So if you have a child who's been placed into foster care with the child welfare system, the incidence of re-victimization while in care is actually documented as being very low, something under 2 or 3% in the country and is a national average. But many of us know that that number is underreported, and there's probably a much higher rate of maltreatment in foster homes or group care facilities that has gone underreported. But most importantly, we know that actually in the cases of the children who have been separated from parents in our facilities, that are not designed to be child care facilities and in fact violate many of the Flores decision stipulations that we'll learn about when Michelle talks. These facilities do not have certified care providers. They do not have, some of them do. Sorry, some of them do. But the new ones kind of at the border that are just popping up in shopping malls or that are in abandoned office buildings that are not licensed facilities that can legally house children. They're basically warehousing children and washing them in the office room sinks in some facilities that we've learned about, that our senators have visited. And so in those facilities, the child care professionals are not necessarily child care professionals. They're border control agents, and they don't understand child developmental levels or child development stages. And like Diane had mentioned, they're being denied physical contact. They're not allowed to console other children. They're not allowed to have meetings between parents and children who are separated by nothing more than a wall in the same facility. There's lots of things that are happening that are re-victimizing the children who are separated from their parents. There are allegations, current allegations, and several lawsuits that have been initiated by the ACLU and some other organizations around the sexual abuse of children and women in the facilities, the psychological abuse, the being told that your parent has abandoned you or that you must do something stipulated by this behavior to get another outcome. Children have been screamed at and kicked and told not to cry and other kind of things that don't seem like normal caregiving behaviors with children. There's also medical neglect. We've seen reports of children who haven't been cared for, who are, in terms, returned to their families filthy, dirty, with lice. Women who have been medically neglected, who've had spontaneous and premature miscarriages, other people who have committed suicide. Then there's severe emotional neglect, obviously, from not having any stimulation or any kind of physical human contact, and they're being housed in unlicensed facilities. So what happens then, if you survive all of this, and you make it somewhere safe, maybe an ORR shelter, which is the Office of Refugee and Settlement and Refugee Resettlement, you then can begin to think about some normalcy, whether you're reunified with your parents or you're in a facility that's designed to offer normalcy. In some ways, you have these other sources of stress, which is a culture of stress, coming to a place that you know nothing about, that you don't know the language. And in many cases, we've learned in our Guatemala study that some kids don't speak Spanish. And they come and they speak an indigenous language where there is no one who speaks that indigenous language. Not even a Spanish-speaking foster parent can accommodate their needs for language, much less schools. There are social stressors, so marginalization. We know that the current xenophobic climate and context of our country is not kind and welcoming and pleasant to migrants in our schools, not to Muslims, not to Latinos, not to any other outside or brown person, for that matter, in our school systems or in our public settings, as Michael talked about a little bit in the grocery store. We see increasing incidents of hostile and aggressive behaviors that are xenophobic or racist by members of the country in various locations. So we do have a lack of access of supports to these families and children. There are not a lot of trauma-informed interventions or community resources for families, much less in Spanish or other indigenous languages. So we have a real deficit in terms of how we can help and support families who are experiencing these things, and Preeti will talk a little bit about what we can do locally. And there's additional trauma, of course, in just addition to the transit trauma. So in New Jersey, I just talked about most of these gaps. We don't have good numbers in terms of our trauma clinicians. We don't have hardly anyone trained in understanding the polytrauma of migration experiences. There is an inability for providers, all of us, to tell someone we can make sure you stay safe. And the number one method for intervening with children or families who've experienced trauma is removing them from the traumatic event or the fear of that event reoccurring. And we can't necessarily, at this point in time, do that. We can't ensure anyone's safety. In fact, we can't even ensure the safety of naturalized citizens at this current time. So I think it's a real danger for us as clinicians to try to provide a sense of safety and do that when we can't guarantee it many times for ourselves and our own families. So there's no guarantee that these children will actually have any access to services, which is why I think the schools is really going to be our key hub for what we do in terms of developing community. So my words in this dark presentation around how profound and excruciating this trauma is for these children and families is for you kind of a call to action to really be the change that we can make in terms of how we take action at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist, as Dr. Hernandez-McConan mentioned, is going to speak to us about one of the main interface points for the children at the heart of our discussion, which are our schools. Dr. Preeti Haria is an associate professor of special education at Stockton University. She has a PhD in education from the University of Delaware, as well as degrees in special education and elementary education from Lehigh University and the University of Scranton, respectively. She has several years of teaching and research experience in various settings, such as inclusive classrooms, special education classrooms, both in the United States and in India. Her research interests include developing vocabulary and reading comprehension instruction for struggling readers, and enhancing text-based discourse within the context of reading and writing instruction for students with language difficulties. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Preeti Haria to the podium.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me here. It's my honor to be able to be part of this important discussion. And so far, we've heard a lot about how children at borders and children in our society are being neglected, especially our migrant or undocumented students. And I'm going to share some information about how, as a community, what can we do to support our students, our children in our schools or our community. So just to, let me make sure that I'm in the right place, yeah. So here's the plan. As I said, we'll be talking a little bit about our undocumented and immigrant children in our society and in our community and in our classrooms. So before we move on and talk about why we include immigrant children in our classrooms or in our community, I just want us to take a couple minutes and turn to your partner and discuss briefly, how did you behave or how did you feel when you believed that you truly belonged in a group, workplace, or in a family? And also turn to your partner and talk about when you believed you did not belong in a group or felt ostracized from a group. How did you feel and how did you behave? So just take a couple seconds and talk to your partner about when you felt that you belonged somewhere and when you felt, how you felt when you did not belong somewhere. You have 20 more seconds and we'll regroup. Okay, so very quickly I'm going to ask you, so how did you feel and how did you behave when you believed that you belonged in a group? So somebody who can volunteer and quickly tell me, how did it feel or how did you behave? I may just start calling out people. Yes, so when you felt belonged to a certain group or in family, you felt safe, you felt relaxed, you felt comfortable, you felt yourself, like you could be yourself. And how about when you did not belong? Sorry? Intimidated, okay. Anything else? Sorry? Alone, isolated, right? Angry, yeah. Sorry? Uncomfortable, absolutely. So, and this is just, I wanted us to reflect back, to think about our own experiences, how we feel when we are included or excluded from a community or a family. I mean, I'm sure we all have our family stories where we were not welcomed and how it felt. So just, and this is the most kind of a needed emotion which is most neglected and most often. So there's a quote, "To be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul." And this is what our conversation is going to be about. So what can we do to support children in our community and in our schools, and how can we help and support as a common person to person, from individual to individual, what can we do in our community? So just providing them sense of belonging and security. And we know that if there is no sense of belonging or that safety, or if you're feeling intimidated, there's no learning happening, there is no sort of any positive interaction happening. This just shows us that how it feels when we are lost and abandoned and how we feel included. So who are our undocumented immigrant individuals in our community? And as Robin pointed out, they're traumatized, they feel insecure, unsafe, not included. They are in new language, hearing new language, many of them, or they are a new culture. But at the end of the day, they are all human beings. They all want to feel secure. They all want to feel safe. And they want those basic needs to be taken care of, about safety, security, food, and warmth. And they have similar aspirations and dreams. I often tell my students also that it doesn't matter whether the individual has disability, whether the individual is from different race, culture. We all have similar dreams and aspirations. So we as a community have to work together to bring those aspirations and dreams to fruition with our solidarity with our human race. And so these are some of the things I would point out, like no matter who the children are or who the individuals are, their aspirations are to have good education. People who are leaving their countries, who are traumatized in their countries, and they're leaving their country and coming to our country in hopes of that they will have better education. They will have better employment. They will have a safe environment, hopefully that they are not sort of, constantly bombarded in their environment with drugs and that insecurity of losing their lives. So that's the premise of what we want to think about as a community, that are we being able to do that? And school is a great place. School has always played as a catalyst to help our students, to help our community to sort of create that safe environment. I'll tell you a little story. Like when I was working in Wilmington, Delaware, I was working in an inner city school, and often on Fridays, I would see the kids eating like twice the amount, or they're stuffing themselves, or if there is anything dry lunch, they're trying to put it in their bag. And one day I asked a student, why are you eating? And he was eating so fast and how much ever he could eat. And he said, over the weekends, I'm not going to get food. So that's why I'm eating on Friday. So school is one place that is a safety net for them. That's the place that provides them with the food. That's the place that gives them some normalcy of learning and taking away from that dark reality and sort of helping them to dream. And so that's why talking about schools and what we can do in schools is so important. So what happens when we do not practice some of these things or deny public education to our students? One of the things, what Robin pointed out, that when we are not caring, what happens is we are creating more difficulty for us in our nation because we are not responding to these students and providing that education so that they can become productive citizens of our country. So what happens that these children are being victimized, and also as community, we are wasting our resources in sort of trying to have these these are migrant children, or these are children who don't belong in our society, and we are wasting that resources instead of really cultivating them and helping them to be more productive citizens. So just quickly, before we get into talking about what can we do as community, what I would like to say that what are our rights of undocumented students, or what are the rights of our students who are non-citizens. I'm not going to go over all the case laws and everything, but as a community, as an individual of a community, to think about that we do not have the burden to think about looking at the documents of children who are coming to our schools, whether they are legal, illegal, or what kind of status they have. That's not our role. Of course, we look at whether they are, they have vaccinations or other documents which the school needs. That's a different document than whether they are documented citizens of this country or not. So as a school, we have an obligation under the law. We have an obligation to provide education to every student coming to our classroom. So every student coming to our schools, we have an obligation to provide them education, and that is non-discriminatory education. We cannot discriminate or provide services to few and not provide services to the students who don't have proper documentation. So that's in a nutshell, that's the role of a school, is to provide education and not worry about the paperwork. And this is, again, going back to talking about some laws. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but if the student, under federal law, if the student is not speaking the language, it is the school's obligation to provide those services, to provide interpreters, to provide, and also to tell them about their rights. It is the school's obligation to tell them about their rights. If the student who is immigrant and who has disability, it is absolutely the school's obligation to let the parent know what under IDEA law that the student is eligible to get the services, special education services. So bottom line is that our obligation is to provide education, to provide services, ELL, so like ESL services, that is English is their second language, then we need to provide them within, the interpreter. And if they have any disability or they need special education services, it's the obligation of the school to provide those services. So who are these local communities and what is the role of schools? I just wanted to point out, school is one of the local communities, but place of worship or the community centers, local organization, healthcare facilities, our obligation is not to check the papers. Our obligation is to provide the services, what we are supposed to provide services. So as community members, we should be just worried about providing those services to our members. What are the supports that we can provide are provided by the community. So along with school, providing job training or language training, if the individuals need language training or any type of a job training, the community centers and the places of worship or schools can provide, in conjunction with other organizations, they can provide those services. Financial literacy, that could be another place where helping them to understand how to sort of take care of the budgeting and other financial factors. Linguistics and cultural support. Again, as we said, many immigrant children or individuals coming to our country may or may not speak English language and may or may not be aware about some of the cultural nuances. So supporting them and helping them to be aware is sort of a role of a community to help them. And also recreation and leisure activities. We all, we cannot be like all day work, work, and work. So also, as a community centers providing recreational services is a part of whole human being and a well-being of a person. Collaborating and capitalizing with their strengths of immigrants. If we know in our community, if we have shortages of interpreters, or if we have shortages of understanding each other's culture, they can work they can help us and be a productive citizen to help us in interpreting each other's culture and to be able to be a liaison between their community and the community where they are coming and staying. So really thinking about how can we capitalize on individual strengths, because no matter where they are coming from, if they have survived all those traumas and everything and now they are being part of our community, they definitely have a lot of strengths and a lot of resiliency. So there is a lot to learn from our community partners who are non-citizens. Connect them with appropriate services, resources, and people. There are lots of resources, and sometimes individuals who are new to this country, they may or may not know about those resources. So as a school, as a library, as a place of worship, we can identify those resources and be able to connect them. So these are some of the roles which, as a community, which we can play. Then what is the role of a school? So as a school, we create a supportive, culturally sensitive, and welcoming environment. As I said, as I pointed out, that school is often not only for our non-citizens, but for our citizens of our country who come from an impoverished background, is often a safety place, is a place where they find that bit of normalcy which they don't find elsewhere in the community or a society. And focusing and working on building community rather than thinking about that you're from different race or different culture. How about we can think about our similarities and focusing on our similarities and learning from our differences. And that's the way we could build our communities. There are lots of, I've actually put together a few resources and given to Dawn, and she will share it with you through email, where you can do some community building activities in your classroom or in your community to work and to develop that sense of community. And as I mentioned earlier, avoid asking for documents, especially about their status, because that's not our role. That is the officials. We are not trained for that. As a community member, as a school, if you're working in school settings, our role is to provide the service which we are trained for. So that is our role. And reach out to parents and guardians and many children who are in foster care or privately, many refugee students are being taken care by private families through private organizations. And these children are in our classroom. They may be coming from different culture, their family, foster care family may be coming from different culture, reaching out and trying to work through families and making them our partners is important in serving our students in our classrooms. Just like no matter who the child is, no matter who the student is in your classroom, their needs are basically academic needs, social needs, emotional needs, behavioral needs, linguistics or cultural needs in our classroom. So as I kept on emphasizing that our role in our community is, if we are in school settings or in any community settings, our role is to provide those services and support that regardless of who that student is or what their abilities are, what their racial background is. And this is, of course, as I come from education background, I talk more often from that perspective, that how we can support, and school as being the major institute which kind of acts as a catalyst and that safe grounds. So talking from that perspective, and just thinking about this little cartoon here is about, if we look at that, this person in wheelchair is saying, could you please shovel the ramp? And the person who is shoveling the ramp, the stairs, is saying, all these kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I'll clear the ramp for you. So the person in wheelchair is saying, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. So the point of this cartoon is, it doesn't matter. It's like creating that universal environment where all our students with all different abilities and race and culture can thrive. So that's what we want to create in our school setting, is the universal learning environment. So how do we do that? So providing access to relevant resources and accommodation. As I mentioned earlier, many of our students may not speak the same language, may not have the same cultural understanding of how schools function in the United States. So providing those kind of resources or working closely with ESL teachers and really understanding how can I provide this in my own classroom. That doesn't mean that student has to be identified and provide that service officially, but also in our classroom as a teacher, we can provide that. Working with a social worker and helping to be that liaison between the family and schools and understanding what our students' needs are in our classroom. Providing access to education. Again, we think that because they are in school, they have access to education. Many times the curriculum, as I said, could be very different, and providing that access and just giving them a little more accommodation. For example, I would say kids may not know what this sentence means. Please underline this important word. If we can draw or show an example, that can be helpful. Or just giving verbal direction may not be helpful for our students who are not being, but just giving a picture along with verbal direction or showing them or modeling for them may just be that little added support which we can provide to our students who are linguistically different than what our regular schools are. As I mentioned, providing ESL services, provide access to special education services. Children who may not be diagnosed, but we are seeing that these children are having difficulty despite providing all sorts of instruction and intervention. So referring them, maybe parents don't know about these services. So really referring and working very closely with school psychologists and special education teacher and asking them to come and observe in our classroom to see how we can support our learners in our classroom if they have other difficulties than the linguistics or cultural difficulties in our classroom. Provide access to interpreters, as I mentioned earlier, and also teaching students self-determination and advocacy, helping them to really build their self-esteem and advocate for themselves, how to ask for their rights. Many from many cultures, especially I can tell you from coming from India, we do not question authority. So when I first came to United States, I would never ask questions in the classroom. And often the professors would say, you should ask questions. And as a part of the culture, as when I was growing up, we didn't ask questions to our professors or our teachers. So really helping the students to understand about their rights and about to really profess for themselves is very important. And understanding that cultural difference, that the student may have questions or difficulty, but is not being able to say because of the cultural differences. Create, as I mentioned earlier, create universal learning environment which everybody can access, like that ramp. Everybody can access that learning, creating that warm environment in our classroom is important. Then creating a welcoming classroom community. This goes further into how we can do that in our classrooms. How can we create that warm environment? Is, as I mentioned earlier, identifying similarities and differences. We know that as humans, we have lots of similarities, and of course we have our uniqueness. So drawing upon that and sharing our stories. As I just mentioned, my stories, I'm sure we all have our stories about being included, excluded, or about coming from different community or family. I can tell you all about Indian family and my family, right? So every person coming to our classroom has stories, and sharing that and seeing those commonalities is helpful, and creating that sense of belonging. Also using different kinds of games and engaging activities in our classroom, and opportunities for positive civic engagement. Again, it's important, as I said, teaching all our students about rights, teaching about humanitarian rights, and discussing about race and immigrant issues openly in our classroom is important. Open dialogue is very important. I think many things are happening in our classroom and in our community is out of ignorance and out of not understanding what it means to be a non-citizen, or any given issue. What does trauma means? What does it mean that these children have left their country and come to our country? So having that open discussion is important. And this is kind of a reiteration of what I've been talking about, creating positive learning environment in our classroom. And what kind of accommodations and what little things we can do in our community and in our classrooms to support our students and in our community. And this is, again, going back to talking about universal design for learning. And this is a concept which really is important, not only in classrooms, but also thinking about in our communities, talking about how can we engage our learners, because no matter what, there is only this many differences or this many similarities. So we all, as learners, need to be engaged in learning. And of course, it doesn't happen if students are not feeling safe, are not feeling secured. Creating safe and secured environment is important. And also, creating engaging environment is important for learning to take place. Because our focus in our schools and communities should be to really help us, our individuals to be as productive citizens as possible. Then as teachers, what we can do is present materials in different ways. As I mentioned earlier, maybe drawing a picture or verbalizing and showing the students may be helpful to understand the message, what you're trying to say. And also allowing students to express in different ways. Not only just writing papers, but maybe in many different ways the students can present what they are learning and understanding. I know this was a very quick overview of how to support in our school community and in our community at large. And after Michelle presents, we will have a large question and answer session, but you've been given note cards. You can start writing your questions if you have any questions. And now Michelle will talk more about the policies. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So yes, as Preeti mentioned, directly following our next panelist presentation, folks will be coming down to collect your questions on the note cards. Our final panelist that I would like to introduce for you now is Michelle J. Douglas. She is certified by the New Jersey Supreme Court as a civil trial attorney, and her practice is dedicated to helping those with legal, employment, and civil rights matters. She has been named a super lawyer in the field of employment, labor law, and civil rights by New Jersey Monthly Magazine on a number of occasions. She received her Master's of Studies in Law with a concentration in employment and labor law from Widener University, and continues to be actively interested in programs for the advancement of civil rights and immigration laws. She is also a member and public policy chair of the American Association of University Women, the Atlantic County branch, and for that organization, she serves as the director of Tech Trek, a STEM camp for girls in collaboration with Stockton University. Ms. Douglas has tried over 125 jury and non-jury trials and has advocated for clients in federal and state court and before administrative law judges in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New York, and Washington. Ms. Douglas is deeply committed to equal rights for all citizens and providing safe and humane policies on immigration, including the protection of innocent children, which is, of course, what she's going to speak to us about today. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am the sole attorney here, and I am honored to be included with this wonderfully committed group of panelists, these academic professionals. And I am here to weigh in on the policy and advocacy aspects of immigration. And if you think about it, as Dr. Rodriguez had indicated, it's how we frame an issue in large part. And this seminar, indeed, stems from the hardline approach taken by Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential elections. Why do I say that? Because his Put America First campaign directly attacked immigrants. And if I knew how to work, here we go. All right. Now, after Donald Trump became the president of the United States, it wasn't until January of 2018 in which he rolled out his immigration plan. It wasn't law yet, but it was a plan. And that plan, in good part, did call for a pathway to citizenship for the dreamers. These are the kids that are here in the United States that are undocumented, that they were brought over during their childhood to live here, they were schooled here, they're Americans. Well, he did provide in his plan for a path to citizenship. You know that there is no direct path for these kids now to citizenship, that is to lawful permanent residency, other than what President Obama did, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he did that, Donald Trump, let's not be fooled, he did that for purposes of gaining concessions, right, from the Democrats, because the DREAM Act, which has been stalled ever since 2014, has not taken place. Indeed, there is really no legislative, comprehensive, up-to-date current legislation. It's been stalled through the House, the Senate, you name it. But this immigration plan that Donald Trump and his administration had rolled out intended to provide for kids, dreamers, to become citizens. But in exchange, he also had to appease the Republican hardline approach, right? And in doing so, his proposal was to eliminate President Obama's DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Children Arrivals. Again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. But he wanted to gut it, replace it, and he also wanted to do away with TPS, which is the Temporary Protected Status that you heard some other of my esteemed colleagues talk about earlier, protects certain people in war-torn countries or whose countries have otherwise experienced some catastrophic event. It protects them, gives them legal status, lawful status to be here on a temporary basis. But in that much publicized, notorious meeting that President Trump had with some of his officials, in which he called those countries shithole countries, remember that, we learned that the temporary protected status was being proposed as an elimination, maybe not so much because of legitimate policy reasons. And this morning I learned, thanks to Robin, who emailed me, I think at 6 a.m. this morning, to let me know, because I had been keeping up with all of the current events on policies regarding DACA and TPS. And only as of this morning did we learn that a United States judge in Boston, she ruled in favor of a group of TPS-affected citizens, using that word wrong, TPS individuals. She granted their application so that they are now permitted to stay here on TPS status, these people being primarily from the countries of Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And the basis for her decision, preliminary albeit, but the basis for that decision was the discriminatory racial animus that the collective plaintiffs could point to, in part with respect to President Trump's pronouncement that these countries were shithole countries. Having said that, this immigration plan also did away with the diversity lottery. It wanted to do away with the diversity lottery. It also wanted to do away with what we have called chain migration, so that citizenship or even lawful permanent residency can only be afforded to direct members of one's family, that is, a spouse or a sibling. But, once here in the United States, either a person with a green card, i.e. lawful permanent residency, or somebody who actually, plowed through that torturous route and gained citizenship, having come over with documented papers. Once having received that citizenship, they then were here, and that afforded people in their homeland an ability, right, to come here and also gain citizenship. Well, he wanted to do away with that as well, because in order to get Republicans on board, right, he had to have somewhat of a hardline approach, and so that was what he did, with one thing in mind, in essence. In order to be able to get a $25 billion trust fund set up for establishing a wall along our southern border with Mexico. Now, what I want to do is, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the terms that I used, such as DACA and TPS, and history does matter here. And I want to tell you about DACA and its history. I'm not going to get in, this is not an in-depth legal analysis, but it's enough information, I hope, that provides you with some ideas. And many of you may already be generally or even specifically familiar with those laws, but it helps us to reinforce that knowledge. DACA, right now, there's approximately 1.8 million people who could benefit from the continuation of DACA, the Deferred Action for Children Arrivals. This came into effect, this policy, by way of executive order, came into effect under President Obama, and it's been under attack ever since, 2 weeks, as a matter of fact, after he announced the executive order. It was under attack in the court system. It initially failed. The courts weren't buying it. That they believed that President Obama was empowered with the authority to decide not to prosecute, to exercise that discretion, that prosecutorial discretion, not to prosecute kids who had come over here through no fault of their own, but because they were brought here to escape bad situations or for better economic situations by their parents. They're undocumented kids that have come here. That was passed initially in 2012, which allowed for these people to be here for 2 years and a renewal on every 2-year basis. It all worked well until, the DREAM Act came about. The Gang of Eight, if you've heard about the Gang of Eight, they were the 8 senators, including Senator Melendez from the state of New Jersey, and some various other senators who's finally put together this package, right, to address the Dreamers and to address a more comprehensive immigration bill. And that just never seemed to be able to, make it. You pass the Senate, then not the House. So it's not law. President Obama threw up his hands. He was fed up, and he said, you know what? I am going to try to do something. In the Rose Garden, he finally announced the expansion of DACA. And what did that allow? That allowed for these children now to be here on a 3-year basis with a 3-year renewal application, and it also provided for parents, called DAPA, the Deferred Action for Parent Arrivals. So that was a big deal because these parents are here as well, who've been living here, breathing the same air as us, participating, paying taxes just like any of us, and he wanted to provide them with some level of protection until Congress got their act together. Well, that immediately went under attack. Indeed, in the state of Texas and a group of other what we call red states filed an action in the district court there. And the long journey of that is that initially the district court judge in Texas, did grant the application. It's called a permanent injunction. That is just a stay. The judge agreed that Obama's expanded. Now, the initial DACA, the initial executive order, didn't come under attack. That had already been decided by courts. What was up for judicial review this time was the expansion of DACA in 2014. And the judge in Texas stated, I'm going to hold off on this because I think under the Administrative Procedure Act that there may be a good likelihood that President Obama overstepped his boundaries. And this judge decided this on some procedural grounds, not on constitutional grounds and not on any other substantive, under the law, substantive grounds. So he stalled that and appeal, Fifth Circuit. Texas is in the Fifth Circuit of the United States federal court system. The Fifth Circuit agreed, took it up to the United States Supreme Court, and we now know that Justice Scalia died, and as a result, we had a Supreme Court that was made up of 8, not 9 justices. So the Supreme Court was tied, 4-4, and they essentially couldn't render a decision, and in a one-sentence opinion, essentially they just affirmed the Fifth Circuit, who affirmed the state court judge. So as far as the expansion of DACA was concerned, that was halted. And then Trump came along. The parties in that United States versus Texas case agreed that they weren't going to further the claims, and it essentially died. That action just died. So then we have President Trump becoming the president, and what happens next? Yep, there we go. Am I not doing this right? Maybe we can. Okay, thank you. So that in September 2017, he announced, that is, the President Trump administration through Attorney General Sessions announced the end of DACA altogether. That is, the initial DACA that was passed in 2012, as well as anything that had to do with an expansion of DACA. But the kicker is that we've had no court weigh in on the constitutionality of a president's ability. And it's been done since the Reagan era, where a president has agreed or has made it part of their policy not to enforce certain laws. But the takeaway from what happened after Trump announced, his administration announced that we're going to do away with DACA, we're not going to afford these kids protection anymore, is that there were a number of lawsuits filed. California, New York, and in Maryland, and importantly, in the circuit within Washington, D.C. And that to me is one of the most important decisions, because there the judge indicated that he believed that the actions of the government in doing away with DACA were arbitrary and capricious, and that there wasn't any good reasoning offered by the government. In fact, the NAACP, who was the primary entity asserting that cause of action, argued that, pointed to, as a matter of fact, Kellyanne Conway, advisor to the administration, her statements blasted all over media, in which the reasoning was pronounced for the elimination of DACA being only to deter. Yeah, we know we're ripping children from the parents' arms. We know that we are breaking families apart. But we have to do this, she argued, to deter people from crossing the border undocumented, illegal aliens. The court held that that's not a legitimate legal basis. But unfortunately, the judge stayed his order, which he essentially granted what's called summary judgment, meaning he agreed. He rendered a final judgment in favor of the plaintiffs in that case, saying that the administration couldn't overturn DACA. But he, I think exercising overly cautious, allowed a 90-day stay, which, by the way, expired yesterday on July 23rd. And that stay indicated that the government had 90 days to come up with a good reason. Like, give me a good reason. Give me a good, legitimate, substantial reason as to why DACA should be eliminated. They haven't done so. So they have until the end of this week, or I think it's a few more days, to file briefs. And so we're not really sure where we're headed yet. My take, albeit my opinion and my opinion alone, is that with regard to renewals, remember these kids were permitted to renew every 2 years, right? That was on hold, but they didn't know what to do. They weren't allowed to renew. Now I think, that they're going to be permitted to renew. In fact, there was other decisions that did in California that did allow this. But I think they're going to be permitted to renew it. I think they're going to accept, I think the Homeland Security, which is charged with this level of immigration enforcement, I believe that they're going to allow new arrivals, new applications as well, until when? Texas also sued affirmatively, but they sued the state of Texas and some other states and other organizations sued to declare DACA unconstitutional. They also did ask the judge in Texas to stay, to allow the executive order from the Trump administration overturning DACA to remain. That judge has never rendered a decision yet. And I suspect, again, my own opinion, but the Trump administration has been under attack for its cruelty with respect to the separation, his zero tolerance policy, which we're going to talk about also. But he's been under attack there, the Russian debacle, and we now know that his administration wants to put forth a very conservative justice, Judge Kavanaugh, as a justice. So I think that the government won't weigh in on the DC case. I think that they're not going to push that. I think they're going to try their avenues out in the Supreme Court eventually. Now, what's the stance of our state here in New Jersey? We're on board with keeping DACA. In fact, our state has indicated that if they eliminated DACA, it would impede all the state efforts. It's a policy of this state. It would impede our efforts in preventing family separation, maintaining public health, and enforcing states' criminal laws. So we're on board, but also we're on board for a financial reason. We would lose $19 million in tax revenues, so it makes sense. Now, just as a summary, again, I'm not going to get into each of the specifics of the cases and who brought what, but you should know, just be aware, because you're going to keep your eyes open in the news, because many of these cases haven't been decided, albeit but one, the lawsuit in federal court in Maryland. And I'm not going to address that just yet, but it doesn't really affect the renewal or the ongoing status of DACA. What does, and what lawsuits to pay attention to, are the ones in California. It's a class action. The lawsuits filed in the state of New York. The lawsuits that were brought in Washington, D.C., we want to keep our eyes open for that because that's the 90-day expiration, which expired yesterday. And importantly, this lawsuit that was filed in Texas, because those claims are pending, and that will lead the pathway to the Supreme Court to address constitutionality, unless, of course, the elections in November bring us another story, and Congress may finally be able to get their act together and address this issue. We'll hold our breath until then. So now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about TPS, the Temporary Protected Status. It was established by Congress back in 1990 through the immigration law at that time. It's a humanitarian program, and it suspends deportation. People come over here to escape war, horrific acts that are ongoing in their homeland, or any other catastrophe. Those catastrophes are identified under federal law. It's an 18-month reprieve, essentially. But over the course of the years from 1990 and on, the identity of those countries has changed, of course, as the world changes. And also, the administrations have been rather liberal in extending the TPS status. Mind you, again, TPS status is not a pathway to citizenship. It's not a pathway to gaining lawful permanency, a green card. El Salvador has the largest population in our country now that is protected by TPS status. And the 10 countries, Sudan, Nicaragua, Haiti, El Salvador, Syria, Nepal, Honduras, Yemen, Somalia, and South Sudan. They are currently the countries that are under TPS protection. Now, what's her name? Nielsen, Homeland Security. So Nielsen just recently extended the TPS status for Yemen and for Somalia. And as I told you earlier, we now know that a judge out of Boston said, we're not going to do away with TPS, at least not for Nicaragua, Haiti, El Salvador. So today, those people have now regained TPS status. Now, again, this isn't a dig in deep how to get permanent status seminar, but you should be aware that once here, I would be counseling my clients if at all possible, you can't rely on TPS status, right, to stay here. Do whatever you can in order to become a lawfully permanent resident. And there are generally, we break them up into two categories. You can get in through the employment spectrum, so to speak, I'm saying this generally, or you can get in through the family spectrum. You know, your family was here as a lawful permanent resident, was a citizen. But for many people, neither route is available. So they've got to think outside the box. Asylum is essentially a thing of the past under this administration. But if you're lucky enough to get asylum, then know that there was a 1-year clock that ticked. That is, you had 1 year from the date you entered this country in order to make your application for asylum. But if you have TPS status, that stops that clock. Trump's zero tolerance policy was announced on April 6, 2018. There, it became 100% prosecution. The real hoax, however, is about the border crisis. I mean, he started his campaign indicating that there was a crisis on the border, but the statistics, indeed, a report called a refugee report commissioned by the Trump administration, factually says just the opposite, that immigrants don't commit more crime than natives, they commit less. They got to stay under the radar, right? They are, as a group, employed more, unemployed less. They are, as a group, contributors. And the people against this argument say, my goodness gracious, how can the Trump administration say this with a straight face? We've got 3.8% unemployment right now. How can they say this with a straight face in light of the report, the commission report, which wasn't made public by the administration, it was made public only through the Washington Post. The real culprit, actually, if you want to know the honest truth, is that there are more people here, 600,000 more people here than people crossing the border who are people that came here legitimately initially. That is, they had a visa, but they overstayed their visa. Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor says, I'm insulted, when she was interviewed on Fox News, that we refer to people, again, framing the issue. We call them illegal immigrants, illegal alien. Why are they just undocumented people? So why do we make it criminal? Why do we make it criminal? There's an awesome book out there I suggest. It's a worthy read, How Immigration Became Illegal by Aviva Chomsky. And her take is her bottom line, the skinny on it, is that she believes that it's made criminal to exclude on behalf of the powerful and the privileged, and to exploit those who are otherwise powerless. Also, the war on terror helped with the criminalization. In fact, the Homeland Security became born under President Bush. But you want to know what saddens me is that, can anybody guess what president has deported more immigrants than any president in the United States history? One guess. Yeah. The deporter-in-chief, right? 2.5 million. But, in fairness, it was because of the way we define deport. See, under the Bush administration, the first part of it, it was just too unwieldy, right? First of all, Homeland Security, as we know it today, didn't exist. Cost a lot of money to deport, give somebody their due process, have a hearing, detain them. Cost a lot of money. So they were just catching and releasing, they called it. Another bad phraseology, catch and release, like a fish. But that's what they were doing. They would catch the person crossing the border and escort them back. Now, under Obama, the law changed. He was required to officially deport. That means fingerprints. That means the whole hearing process. I don't know if I have enough time to play this video, but we're not going to do it because you know why? If you get a chance, the Washington Post has a whole series of really fabulous video clips on issues of public policy. One is by this Karen Attiah. She's a well-known global editor for the Washington Post. And just as many of my colleagues have indicated, if you think family separation is un-American, check your history. It's pretty cool, and if you get a chance to ever play it to your children or in an educational setting, I highly recommend it. Now, we do know on June 20th, Trump ends family separation policy, as Robin told you. It's kind of illusory, and I provided a timeline. We know October 7th, there were major increases in our history of prosecutions. Then in April, Sessions announced the zero tolerance policy. Then June 20th, that's essentially rescinded. Not the zero tolerance policy as a whole, only the separation of families. So what does that mean? What does that mean? I think it means that now this administration wants to detain kids with parents indefinitely, or until they finally get their due process and a hearing. That's uncalled for. There's no law, absolutely no law under this United States sun that allows the separation of children from their family. The June 20th executive order didn't address a whole penumbra of things. It didn't address reuniting the families. It didn't provide the families who were traumatized by being separated. It didn't require, importantly, it did not require the end of family separation. And, very interesting, it didn't say that it was going to eliminate, God bless you, any plan that might raise the specter of internment camps. That's in quotes because it's taken right out of the complaint that has been filed by 17 states, including New Jersey, regarding this zero tolerance policy. That is currently before the court. And why do they reference this lack of the zero, the rescission of part of the zero tolerance policy? Maybe, or could have addressed the elimination of internment kind of camps, is because Attorney General Jeff Sessions went to a court ex parte, meaning without another side, on his own, didn't have another side present, to ask that we eliminate the Flores settlement. Robin had mentioned Flores settlement earlier. Just know in your mind that it's been around a while, 1997, it's been consistently in existence, the Flores settlement, which has at its very heart the policy and practice, the required practice, to release children with unnecessary delay. To who? To their guardian. First and foremost, we got to find out who the parent is. Next, guardian. No guardian, then to a responsible governmental agency. Because the goal should be the least restrictive setting for our children. And what bothers me the most is that no matter what way you want to frame an issue, and no matter what way you want to look at this, and we're all looking at this legally, policy, who's stepping up to the plate to address our moral and our ethical obligations? Why isn't that first and foremost in our debates, in our discussions? It should be. We are all living on the planet together. Very briefly, what happens with unaccompanied children? You should know, because a lot of these kids that you saw in the detention centers that the media made, thank goodness for the media making much. They were able to capture children in, deplorable situations, wailing for their mothers or their fathers or their siblings. You should know that the federal law says they can be held for 72 hours. That's 3 days, ladies and gentlemen, 3 days. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do as a society? That's a question. And I think, unless Congress acts, that we're going to leave it to the hands of the next embodied United States Supreme Court. So where do you go for help? Where do we send our people? Well, you should know that many of these folks can't afford a lawyer, right? And many small law firms, like myself, can't afford to represent en masse the numbers of people that desperately need assistance. But thankfully, some huge mega firms, national firms, have stepped up to the plate. Big firms. And some of them here, with a presence here: Arnold and Porter, Baker and McKenzie, Gordon and Reindel, Deckard Price. Well, it's called Deckard now. It was Deckard Price. Proskauer Rose, Shearman and Sterling. They are taking cases. You know, people, refer them over there, because that's how we effectuate change. Everybody loves to hate a lawyer until you need a lawyer, right? You should know also the Camden Center for Law and Social Justice. We have a presence here in Atlantic County, as well as the Catholic Charities of Camden. We have a presence here in Atlantic City. They've been very active these days. Casa Esperanza, ACLUA, taking major stances. Contribute. You know what I do? I give $1 a day to some of these. $1 a day. And my child, hopefully, will live in a better world. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Our two, Dana and Elena, are going to come into the aisles now. If you could please pass your questions to the aisles. Dan will be over here. Elena, if you could go over there on the other side. And so just pass your note cards to the end of the row, and someone will come around and collect it for you. In the meantime, can we give one more round of applause for all of our panelists this morning, please? Please hold up your note card if there's some there, some down here. Perhaps in the meantime, can I ask the panelists if there's anything that from other panelist presentations that jumped out to you that you wanted to comment briefly on while the questions are coming to the fore? Please, Michael.
Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see that court decision from California that stopped family separation, and it was on procedural grounds. And what the judge said was that the government was doing a very sloppy job of tracking the children that were being separated, and that they were doing a much better job of tracking the property that immigrants in detention possess, because they have records when you're taken into custody, to detention, of what you have, but they were doing a much better job of tracking the property, the items, than the children. And that was a violation of due process, obviously unfair, and that was one of the reasonings, the reasoning behind the decision to stop it, which I thought was just amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, let's begin to hear some of the questions.
Thank you all for your presentations today. Which organizations do any of you know of that need volunteers?
Oh, wow. All of them.
So the question was, which organizations do we know of that need volunteers? So depending on the capacity of your knowledge and your skill set and what your time availability would be like, I think there's a wide range of organizations. There's immigrant rights organizations in New Jersey. There we have actually provided to you in the file folder a map of your congressional districts for the state of New Jersey. So these are all your representatives and your voting districts. So you have their their name is here. Their contact information is very easy to find, to be able to reach out and contact your member of Congress to advocate or to state your position on a particular issue, on this issue. There is the Helping Hands Serenity Home, which is Center for Family Services. Is this you, Omar? So one of our MSW alumni is the director, or some head dude at this organization, which is in Camden, which is an ORR shelter that houses the unaccompanied youth who have come without any family resources temporarily, and provides a more normal sense of kind of family-based or group-based care that's different from the strip mall warehouses where children are being housed in cages. KIND is also here, which is a New Jersey, I believe it's a national organization, right? So KIND is a national organization, and there are a bunch of others. So there's the ACLU, there is NAACP, there is children's rights organizations. There are many organizations that are providing advocacy efforts. There are also many social service organizations that are providing voluntary transportation to reunify families in terms of fundraising campaigns to provide money to bring the mom from Phoenix to New York because they've been separated to that extent. So there are many organizations, and I encourage you, I have a Facebook page for social welfare, media, and advocacy, and then consult any of the resources in here. We've all provided hyperlinks in our PowerPoints that will be accessible to you via email that have dozens of organizations in which you can become active. I would also just like to emphasize Preeti's work in terms of building communities and schools, the one place we know where kids will show up with their families once they've kind of filtered through these systems, and that's the one place we can guarantee that we can provide them with welcoming, open arms to mitigate some of the trauma and stress.
Thank you. Elena?
Thank you for your presentations. There was a comment, looking for a response or comment on withholding of federal funds to New Jersey and other states who are not cooperating with current immigrant policy.
Do you want to address? That's been, a court has made a determination on that and found that that is illegal. You can't hijack federal funds. And without getting into the constitutional reasons and other legal reasons, that was a proposal. The Trump administration did threaten it. It was fought out in a legal battle, and Trump lost.
Thank you.
Okay.
So sanctuary stands in places, yeah.
Dan?
This question's for Dr. Rodriguez. How do we as social workers advocate against negative framing of vulnerable populations, such as immigrants, proposed by the dominant culture? What would be the most effective way?
This obviously is a very difficult question because it's so easy and convenient to accept the framing that is presented to us in the media by our political leaders. But I think just a very simple question in engaging in discussion is, what is our starting point? What is the primary value that we begin with? What is the underlying assumption in the categories that you are presenting and the names and the labels that you are presenting? And having that discussion at a personal level, individual level, in a broader level. It is an error to just uncritically accept what is presented to you without trying to understand not just explicitly what those terms mean, but also all their connotations. And that occurs with clients, it occurs with the media, it occurs with our elected officials, and at a very personal level as well. I mean, I'm not sure that that's a very helpful, but I think that's the way to do it. Because...
If I may, Doctor.
Go ahead.
And on a practical level, it takes some exercise of discipline, right? Yeah. In other words, just start with one practice a day. For instance, try substituting illegal aliens with undocumented. Just try that and keep that in your mind. I do it at my household. Sorry, guys. But I do it in my household where I'm raising a daughter. I have to, and I know it's just a slang term, but I don't say, come on, guys, let's go, guys. Come on, gals, people. But you have to make an effort to change your language. And you're right, it's very difficult when you're being bombarded from media and social media and the news with words like illegal aliens.
Yes, yeah. Anybody else?
You know, I would just add commentary that this is a question that one of our MSW students has raised this semester in my trauma course this summer. And we've spent much of the semester so far trying to really parse through how do we change other people's thinking. Yeah. And becoming, I mean, ourselves, we can become critical thinkers. We're more educated than 90% of the people in this country if you have a master's degree or 1 day of graduate education for that matter. And how do we become teachers and share with others kind of the critical thinking skills where you begin to think about what are your personal values and not what are these groupthink methodologies for categorizing people and constantly assigning blame or otherness to those.
I also do this little exercise with folks. I ask them, what is the worst thing you've done in your life? And then I ask them, how would it feel to be defined in your totality by that one action? So we define people that are present and living in this country by the method of entry into the country. And that becomes the totality of that person. It's very dehumanizing, it's very demeaning. I don't think anybody here would accept being defined by the worst thing you've done in your life. As your total being, your personhood is just about that. I mean, that's just a very simple question, but I think oftentimes we allow the language that enables that kind of thinking to just go out there unchallenged.
Good point.
You know, I'm from Texas, and it breaks my heart when I hear family members or other Latinos refer to undocumented workers or immigrants as mojados, in just a very casual way. You know, but if I don't challenge that, I'm complicit in that. Right? And that's a very simple, you know, I've heard members of my family use that term. And it's at that level that one begins to, but then also in our professional lives, in our relationships, and how we think. That's why I always keep going back to asking yourself, taking a step back, and trying to really disentangle how it is that we think about X and all the associations, because a lot of these associations are visceral. Look, you know, MS-13 is a powerful visceral image. But then to take that image and extrapolate it and generalize it to all immigrants, that's a huge leap. But it's presented as if it's inevitable and self-evident.
Thank you very much. Elena?
A theme in the questions is the social worker's role in assisting migrant children and families who have experienced trauma. So some of the participants asked, could it be made mandatory that there are social workers specialized in family resources at detention centers? If children are able to have a stay, can they get economic help for therapy? And what should the role be of the licensed clinical social worker in helping migrant children and families?
So I think this speaks to the Flores decision, which talks about, and I think, you know, and Michelle talked about the legality of Flores, and one of the secondary parts of it is that any child who's detained in a facility, the facility must be licensed as a child, like an educational center, right? So something like if you imagine all the licensing that your child's daycare center has to go through, and all of the credentials of the people who work there, and all of the regulations with door locks and these kind of things, or light socket protectors. Those are the kind of regulations that the facilities in which children are living in supposed to adhere to. There's one facility in Pennsylvania called Burke's Detention Facility that's housing families now. And what the way they get around those adhering to the state licensure requirements is they send the children out at night to go to temporary foster homes, and then return them to the facility during the day so that they are not technically living at the facility. So they get around the regulations that Omar's facility has to adhere to, which are real hardcore residential facility type licensing. And so it's really hard for us to demand that any of the normal services that we would expect, even in a licensed daycare facility, be in these facilities, because they're essentially really giving us, they're evading all of the requirements and licensure requirements that the facilities are supposed to have to begin with. So making demands that they have certified and trained trauma experts as social workers, I think is a really wonderful, I mean, it's optimal, but I think it's a very long stretch for us. We can't even get them to have showers in some of the facilities, so I think it's a wonderful afterthought. The idea is that the kids could be in the community and have access to those services rather than in facilities.
Maybe we could split that $25 billion, you know, wall help.
Or the parade, maybe the parade money?
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Dan?
Questions for Dr. Haria. How can instructors and teachers create or promote a balance and tolerance for non-immigrant students in a classroom setting?
Can you repeat the last part?
Sure. I'll just repeat the whole question. How can instructors and teachers create or promote a balance and tolerance for non-immigrant students in a classroom setting?
So one of the things, as I said, that really tapping into our similarities and differences and talking about our stories. The other way is also thinking about bringing different literature to our classrooms. I teach often literacy development and to younger kids in elementary setting. So there are lots of Cinderella stories all around the world. There are lots of different versions of Three Little Pigs. I mean, I know I'm talking elementary, but those are some of the things like stories. Storytelling is a great way to be able to teach about tolerance, kindness, and also, again, coming back to framing, like how are we saying things? Instead of saying that, you know, you're not paying attention, you need to sit in the corner, rather than that, how can we change that to be a little more positive and thinking from, instead of punitive way, how can we think from more positive way? So some of those things would be helpful in classroom, bringing, as I said, bringing different literature, creating like a wall of kindness, talking about what was one kind thing you did over the weekend. So these are little things, but they really add up in your classrooms.
Thank you. Elena?
Another question, what happens to children who cannot be reunited with family?
Well, so there's a couple possible scenarios in New Jersey, depending on if they, these children who are not being reunified with family, but many of them, they've already misleadingly deported their parents. In New Jersey, we actually, in our child protection system, we have a longstanding contract with an organization called International Social Services, who is a national and international social work organization whose responsibility is to locate families, regardless of where they are, intercontinental, international, and be able to reunify children with those families. So there's two things, that there's going to be two competing priorities. Do the families want the children to stay here and have an opportunity, or do the families want to be reunified in their country of origin? I argue that that's the parents' decision and the family's decision, that we can't make that decision for them. And so we can move from both angles. If the child's parents is deported and they want the child to stay and they decide that's in the best interests of the child, then they move through ORR, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They have facilities, institutional care, then that works into privatized foster homes that are family care, that are not regulated in the same way that we regulate our public foster homes. So there's some backdoor there, and then they can be living with those families long term. You know, sometimes they'll show up in our foster care system, in our public child welfare system, and that's when we are beginning to feel the need to have a stronger response in our systems. It's not very permanent.
Okay.
So this is also for Dr. Hernandez-McConan. What can we do on a clinical level to address complex trauma as a result of the negative experience that immigration that's occurring?
So there's a body of work that's endorsed nationally and has a lot of evidence to support it. And it's through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org. They have a wonderful website that has federally funded research in terms of using empirical interventions to work with youth and children who had experienced complex trauma, all different kinds of trauma. You can actually go through their website and work through the University of South Carolina and get a certification in trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, so you can become trauma-informed as a clinician. There's also some underpinnings of those modules that talk about essential elements to protecting children from re-experiencing the traumatic experience, ensuring safety, helping them develop a new narrative about the trauma in a way that's healthy and promotes resiliency in their families. There's a number of kind of instructional empirical materials that you can look at through that organization that provide lots of robust resources for becoming a more clinically, or a trauma-informed clinician.
Unfortunately, due to time, that will have to be our last question, but I want to invite back Dawn Conradi to finish out our day.
So on behalf of the Child Welfare Education Institute, I hope that the information our panelists shared with you today was informative, educational. Please distribute the information wild and just as far-reaching as you want it to go. They're available for you to do that. And like I said at the beginning of the day, that we will follow up in the next couple of days via email, so you'll get all of these things electronically. And those of you who need the CEs, you'll get that certificate in time for the renewal, I promise. And thank you so much to our panelists. You know, we put this together in about 2 weeks. And so those of you who are any type of logistics people, you know what that can be like. And if you do not have a great team, then something like this would not happen as well as it did. So panelists, thank you so much for your valuable time. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your morning to come and listen and learn and hopefully share. So have a great day. Please make sure to hand in your evaluations on your way out and take materials that are on the table. It's the less we have to bring back. And we hope to see you around. Thank you.